good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Terese Decker. I'm a director at 3 Degrees, where I help companies set climate goals and then help them do the work to achieve their climate goals. So today we're going to be focusing on credibility as part of setting a climate goal. So we're going to actually start off with a few poll questions to get a baseline for the conversation this morning and make sure that we've got the right kind of content here for the audience, and maybe I can tailor some things based on the answers that come in here. So take a moment to answer the question so I can get a feel for where folks are at. All right, looks like some votes are coming in here. Looks like a lot of folks are sitting right between already setting a goal, starting to act. So that's perfect. We'll have some time for questions at the end. But if any questions come up along the way, feel free and drop them in the Q&A box. And one of my colleagues is on the line to gather them up and make sure that they get answered either at the end or after the webinar. All right, jumping right in. So first, a little bit about 3 Degrees in case folks are unfamiliar. So we're a company of about 200 people. We're based in San Francisco. We have offices throughout the US and Europe. And our company mission is to make it possible for businesses and their customers to take urgent action on climate change. So that's what we're all about. That's, the work that we do. A lot of what drives what we do is that we're also a B Corp, which means we've pledged to achieve social and environmental goals in addition to our business goals. So let's jump into the content here today. And before getting into the idea of credibility, let's first just talk briefly about why you should set a climate goal. Honestly, there's not really a right or wrong answer here. There's lots of different reasons why people set a climate goal. A major reason that we see a lot with our clients is that, companies want to be a leader in the industry, demonstrate to people, whether it's your customers or your clients or your stakeholders, that your company is taking the climate crisis seriously, that you want to make a difference and be a leader. And then sometimes we see companies set a goal really as part of their competitive landscape, kind of wanting to keep up with their peer companies, show that they're taking action, things like that, maybe they're receiving pressure from an investor or a client or something like that, and kind of need to act on that. So I start with this really because it doesn't really matter what reason you have for setting a climate goal. The most important thing, though, is to make sure that you do it in a credible way. So you want to set a goal that signals to the market that you're serious about it and that you plan to follow through and that you've put some thought into it. Okay, so let's get into what steps you need to take to set a credible climate goal, which is the focus of today. So we've got a 4-step plan laid out here. The first step is that you need to do some homework. You need to do a little bit of work and lay the groundwork for goal setting. And then next, you need to set a goal that aligns with science. And third, you need to have an execution plan to go with your goal. And it may be multifaceted. It may include all kinds of emissions. So we'll get into that a little bit. And lastly, and this is more important than it sounds, you need to celebrate every climate win. So we'll get into each of these in a bit more detail. All right, here's the first step. And this step really has 2 parts, and this is the first part. So the first part here is really about the data. That's understanding your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So just a reminder, scope 1 and 2 are emissions coming straight from your operations, business that you do, And then scope 3 emissions are those that sit outside of your operational boundaries, that you're still responsible for because they're part of your value chain, but they're not coming directly from your business. So in order to do this, you'll need to do a greenhouse gas inventory, which will really set a baseline for where your emissions are currently and help you understand what your goal should be. And it will be kind of the premise for setting the goal. And you'll also want to spend some time getting to know the emissions that lie outside of your operation. So the first step would be the greenhouse gas inventory. But beyond that, you really want to understand kind of what's driving those emissions, where they're really coming from, what kinds of factors are influencing the companies in your value chain, and how it all works so that you can build into your plan that you'll influence the reductions. And so again, those value chain emissions are called scope 3, and typically those account for 90% or more of your organization's emissions footprint. So that's a lot, that's really big. And so it's just really worth kind of spending the time to get the data, spending the time to understand what is going on with your value chain so that you can make an effective plan down the line. And I also want to point out that it may just seem like, oh, it's just data, maybe it doesn't need to be perfect. And that's true, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it's also the building blocks of the entire thing. So I want to encourage you to really spend some time on getting good data so that your plan can be as effective as possible and really have a lot of integrity behind it. So it's okay not to have perfect data, especially the first time around, but you do want to try and have a solid estimate if you can. All right, on to the next part of step 1. So we're still on step 1, laying the groundwork, but the second part of this step is really about the people. So in the first part, we worried about the data. Now we're going to worry about the people. So first, align your internal team. So you may or may not actually be the one doing the emissions reductions projects. So it's important to remember kind of what your role is. You may be an influencer or a project manager, or ultimately you're just shepherding people to do things. So you're likely going to need to find people in nearly every business unit within your company to actually do those projects and do that work. And so you don't just need any people. You need people who understand the importance of this work, who have the time and the resources to focus on the work. And these are people who most likely don't have the word sustainability in their title. They're people who, maybe never had any education about sustainability or interest in sustainability, but, it's part of your job to get them excited, to get them going, and to kind of inform them about what it is that you need to make this a success, and then find people all throughout the business to do that. And then the other part of the people is your leadership. So your leadership are the ones who are going to be, approving the costs and approving the plans and things like that. So you want to make sure you have management buy-in early so that you can really sell the benefits of this kind of work to the whole company with management behind you. It's also, when you're thinking about the people who are going to help with this kind of thing, it's worth thinking through and keeping in mind the different factors that are unique to your organization. So and what I'm talking about is things that will impact how easy or hard it is to get this sort of work done, including your company culture, your company values, who your customers are, what kinds of stakeholders you have that influence business decisions, your competitive landscape, who your competition is, and what they're currently doing about climate goals and things like that. So all of this is what I would consider laying the groundwork before setting a goal, both the data and the people. And then we can move on to step 2. All right, so now we're on step 2. And this is probably the area where we'll spend the most time, because this is really the meat of setting the goal. So after you lay the groundwork with the data and the people, you'll have the information and the support that you need to set your goal. And the most important thing for your goal to be considered credible is for it to align with science. So let's dig in here a little bit. The latest science comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's abbreviated IPCC. And it basically says that we must limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid the most catastrophic damage to the environment. So at the most basic level, that's what we mean when we say that the goal should be aligned with science, is it should align with that 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And that ambition includes all three scopes of emissions. So just as a reminder, this means your scope 1 and 2, which are within your boundaries, your operational boundaries, and scope 3 that's beyond that and in your value chain. You have to kind of consider all three scopes in your goal. I think it used to be kind of more common or more acceptable to have just your scopes 1 and 2 as part of your climate goal, but now to set a credible goal, you really need to include all three scopes. And you need to be thinking both short-term and long-term. You know, the future is uncertain, so planning out 10 or 15 years is good. You know, we need to set goals by, say, 2050 or so. But you also need to have a short-term goal and, you know, really make plans for now as well as make plans for later. And that will ensure that you have milestones along the way prior to meeting your long-term goal to keep you on track. I also want to, you know, really touch on the idea of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so we have the SBT logo here on the slide, but and SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, is who has kind of put out the rule book and put out the playbook for how goals should be set to align with science. But there are completely valid and reasonable reasons why some may choose not to actually officially go through SBTI to set their goal. So in order to align with science, you need to align with what the IPCC says, but you don't necessarily have to go through SBTI. There's reasons to go through SBTI though, because it does offer a bit more credibility in that it, you know, it has the backing of science. And so if they sign off on it, it's a credible goal, but and it can stand up to some scrutiny, but you don't have to. And they have tools that you can use and documentation that you can use that's open to the public without having to necessarily do the paperwork and commit the resources to doing that. And I also want to take a minute here to talk about the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, because this is kind of baked into the idea of aligning with science. And this is a question that we get a lot, and it's a good question because it can be kind of confusing. Ultimately, it's confusing, in my opinion, because there's never really been clear standards and definitions that laid out the rules that really made an industry accepted definition of all these terms. And so I think some groups are kind of making it up as they go or things like that. But now we've got some better guidance. And so I just want to touch on that briefly, which is that in some ways, carbon neutrality and net zero can be boiled down to the difference between using offsets to compensate for your emissions versus first abating your emissions and then using removals to take care of the remainder. So the graphs on the slide here are a little bit busy, but what you should really look at is the red dashed line, which is the net emissions, and then the blue dashed line, which is the emissions to limit to the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So the blue line is where we need to get to set a goal that aligns with science. And if you look at the graph on the left, this is basically the graph that shows what the industry is calling carbon neutrality, which is basically if you set a goal and then you use carbon offsets to kind of compensate for the emissions that you have as part of your business. And what you can see is that essentially the red line is still well above the blue line at the end of the target year. And so that is not the path towards credibility. But if instead, so look at the chart on the right, which is the scenario in which you reduce your emissions through operational reductions, and then you remove the residual emissions. That's what's shown on the right. Then your emissions line is below the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway line. And that is kind of what the industry is calling net zero. And so this is a more credible approach because it's aligned with science, and it's, you know, it has the backing of the IPCC. So with that said, there is a difference between carbon neutrality and net zero and the mechanics that go into it, but there is a place for carbon neutrality on your journey. Carbon neutrality can be a good place to start. It can be a good action to take, especially for if your organization has a lot of growth in the future. You might just feel like you want to offset some of that while you get on your way to doing the work towards net zero. All right, so the next step is step 3, which is to make a multifaceted reduction plan. This is my favorite part. This is the part where the fun stuff happens. The reductions start to materialize. And this is really where, you know, you're aligning with science really gives you a lot of credibility, but this really just takes that credibility to the next level, in my opinion, because it really shows that your company is invested in making a plan, not just making an announcement. And so, you know, understanding, of course, that every company is different. There's no one size fits all here. But we have a few bits of advice that you can take. And you know, what you can count on here is that your plan may be big and complicated, even if your company is somewhat small. A lot of times what goes into the company is big and complicated. So, you know, you're going to need to make a plan that tackles all the different kinds of emissions. So don't shy away from it, but embrace it. And knowing where to start can be tough. So there's multiple different ways to approach the kind of the planning part of this and kind of how to start. And so some people might say, oh, just start small, take baby steps, you know, get your feet under you. And I actually like the opposite advice. I like the advice of do something that makes you feel like you have a big win under your belt and really kind of get the energy going, get people excited. You know, we talked about having that internal team on your side. And I really just want to encourage you to like give that team something to get excited about and really start the momentum. So things that fit into this category are some renewable energy procurement, perhaps, or maybe some supply chain initiatives. So we have a little graphic here. If you start with renewable energy procurement strategy, that could take the form of, like, for example, a power purchase agreement, which is a PPA. Which is a contract basically between you and a renewable energy project developer, where you would help fund the project and then in return own both the electricity and the certificates that go with that electricity. And those can amount to lots and lots of reductions and could be a really big win for your operational emissions. So don't get too hung up on starting with the right thing though, because whichever way you choose to start is fine. And there's really no one size fits all here. So your reduction plan may have many swim lanes. You may have some that are smaller, some that are bigger, but achieving the goal will require multiple different initiatives, and it will be definitely a worthwhile undertaking. So just really want to encourage you to embrace that complexity and you know, keep your momentum towards understanding that every reduction counts. So you may feel frustrated along the way. This is a long project. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You'll find you want better data, or you want to see more progress, or you want things to happen more quickly. So you kind of just need to approach this with kind of the mental toughness of understanding that you'll hit roadblocks along the way, and you'll want to get more reductions, and you need to kind of just do this constant dance of getting more data, doing more reductions, getting more data, doing more reductions, and just kind of stay in the game and remember that eventually the reductions will happen. And remember that you set the goal, why you set the goal in the first place, and try and keep making progress. And then the last part here of making a reduction plan is to get other people involved. Again, the people are really important to this, because again, this may be a really big undertaking for your business. And as we discussed before, you'll need people in almost every business unit of your company to help with initiatives, gather data, and really support this. So you might consider some kind of internal education campaign, or an incentive program or something to help get people on board and invested in this kind of project. And that actually leads me to the last step, step 4, of setting a credible climate goal, which is to celebrate every climate win. So as I mentioned, this will require focus from your team, but also from other teams and other people within the company. And it's important to recognize the hard work that people are putting into this effort. And so you might be thinking, how does this relate to the credibility of the goal if this is just an internal initiative to celebrate the climate wins? And the answer is, I really want to encourage you that if you can give folks the right amount of recognition for people who are helping out and making sure that this effort doesn't fizzle, then your goal will have that much more credibility by having the momentum behind it to keep making continual reductions year after year. And so if people don't feel like their contributions are being noticed or are important or are supported by leadership, they might stop prioritizing the climate work, which is obviously the opposite of what we want. So as we discussed, you're probably not really going to be the ones doing the projects. You're probably the ones shepherding them along. So you need to give as much credit as possible to the business teams doing the work. And in the same way that every reduction counts, I really want to remind you all that every person's contribution is important. And so it's your job to make sure that the business units will have the staff and the funding and the resources and the support to really achieve the goal. And so remember that this is about the health of the planet. Every reduction counts, and it is worthy of celebrating. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for your time and attention. Are there any questions to wrap up with? All right, Carlina put in the chat here, what are some best practices for achieving meaningful reductions in a company's Scope 3 GHG footprint? That's a good question. I have some thoughts, and then I'll toss that to Carlina. She's actually an expert on Scope 3 reductions and footprinting. My thoughts on Scope 3 are to really first build a supplier engagement strategy. So essentially, what I mean by that is to really understand who the companies are and group them meaningfully by what they do and what kinds of emissions they have, so that you can really understand what their business looks like and you can help them to reduce their emissions. I'll open that up to Carlina and Catherine, I believe, are my two colleagues on the line. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that?
Thanks, Terese. Yeah, I can talk a little more about this. And I also wanted to address Meredith's question in the chat as well about Scope 3 screens, which I think is a great way to identify where to make those meaningful reductions. So expanding on the Scope 3 screen, if, Scope 3 inventory, it's over 90% of your emissions. So it's going to be a really big task to take on, but a screen will allow you to identify your hotspots. So that means that you can identify areas in your Scope 3 emissions where you can put more time, more effort, and typically this is done looking at the size of emissions. So in a screen, instead of with an inventory looking really deeply, in a screen, you can look at data that's already readily available, such as spend data, and say, these specific categories are going to be really big and really meaningful if I can focus my reductions there. Another way to look at that, aside from just size, is looking within your company and things that may matter, such as employee commute. Maybe it's not a really huge category, but this is something that your employees are really excited about. So that could be, another way to identify areas for reduction.
Thanks, Carlina. Are there any other questions?
We received a couple in the chat, so I think we can tackle those. Janelle, you asked for some tools about identifying scope baselines. So the Bible for GHG accounting is the GHG protocol, and it is the rule book, and it is it does get periodic updates to make it more rigorous and more helpful to folks starting off, but it can be quite overwhelming, which is why a industry of consultants and tools have come up. There are something like 158 different platforms out there to help you measure greenhouse gases and get your baseline, all in varying qualities and varying price points. So and ease of use, right? And so what we find we're helping our clients with sometimes is choosing the right platform. But there are many folks who just want this in an Excel spreadsheet and the ability to just say, here's the numbers, and get the basics. And again, just as Terese said, your data is never going to be perfect, ever. So it is that dance between getting that first baseline and then doing something about it, making some kind of quick win, and then going back and getting, better data. And when you start to go outside of your own operations and go into your value chain, use that as a touch point to get two things done: get better data and start talking about the reductions that you can make. So try and use those touch points for as much as you possibly can.
Looks like we have another question. I'm excited about this one. This says, how can you help companies build internal support for sustainability momentum? Some teams don't have the expertise or drive or capacity to do the necessary work. So I think that's a really good question, because that's a very, very real problem. And, a lot of times the sustainability work isn't the thing that's driving your business forward on a day-to-day basis. And so to build that support, I think, is really a matter of kind of constant education internally. And, you don't want to hit people over the head with it. You don't want to necessarily come on too strong or, pull out the IPCC report on day one or anything like that. But if you can kind of build a little bit of internal momentum organically, I think that would be really a strong way to, and it might take some time. And so I guess I just want to say, this is not like an overnight thing. It might take some time to really get there. But I think if you can just build the support internally in like a really groundwork kind of a way, then I think you'll have better luck. Another thing I like to suggest sometimes is like doing like a trivia happy hour with some of the facts about climate change or sustainability, and just see what people already know and see what people don't know, and offer silly prizes, and maybe have like a lunch and learn from a local sustainability organization, things like that, to really work towards like an education campaign that can get you going.
I would add to that sorry.
Oh, go
Terese.
ahead, Catherine.
I would just add that, generally the cadence that we see for building momentum, oftentimes like you are going to be the first person working on sustainability, and you may be, the lone fighter there for a little bit. I would say that the first step there is getting the measurement, and gathering some benchmarking data to say, where are the pressures coming from for you all to take action, which you shouldn't have to look hard for. And so after you're able to make that argument to your executive leadership to say, we know our data, we know why we need to act. Now I need the leeway to engage, the broader team in doing this work. And oftentimes that's enough to get at least the initial, get past that initial phase. You might be able to hire somebody or hire outside help or buy the tool that you need to do to get better measurement. It is incremental, but you will start to see that momentum build. And just as Terese said, you got to get people involved, right? And have buy-in like early so that they feel like they are part of the action from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. All right, we got one more question. Where can I get more information on getting high quality RECs? My company's emissions are too small to develop PPAs, or are there other options? I'm going to toss this one to Catherine. This is not my area of expertise, but I appreciate the question.
So you're already it's great that you acknowledge and understand that PPAs may not be an option for you. I will toss out there, depending on your company's size, that there is a chance potentially to aggregate with other companies to go out to market to buy a PPA, depending on your size. There's still load thresholds to be an effective buyer of power purchase agreements. But there are other options outside of renewable energy credits and power purchase agreements. Oftentimes local utilities will offer a green option. It is not it is almost always going to come with a premium. And it is likely tied, it is a renewable energy credit product, right? So oftentimes it is more effective, maybe efficient, to buy unbundled renewable energy credits. We have an entire full disclosure. 3 Degrees does sell renewable energy credits. We have a team that can help direct you to high quality. Some recommendations that I would make are that you more and more companies are looking to go somewhat geographically local. Maybe it's in the same ISO or grid area as where your load is located. It's not absolutely necessary. You could buy a national Green E certified REC. That is generally the gold standard for renewable energy credits, is Green E. But increasingly getting more local means that you are truly affecting, you're offsetting the carbon impact of where your load is coming from. So, and then there are some amazing projects out there that we call high impact renewable energy credits, where you can actually have co-benefits in helping environmental justice issues and other things like that. So please do contact us. We'd love to talk to you about renewable energy credits.
Thanks, Catherine. All right. Well, thanks for sticking with us an extra 5 minutes. If you have any other questions, feel free and reach out. My email address is right there on the screen, and I welcome any questions. So thanks for joining.